John Boy.
Lessons from the screen, what we mean is we go through different documentaries to tell you what they gon' do. Give you our lessons, give them our blessings. If they trash, we tell you there is no second guessing. Knowledge is power, but time is precious. And we're here to keep you from them lessons. So sit back as we groove, giving you the review, so you only spend time on the docs that you need to.
Welcome to Lessons from the Screen, the show where we give you a review of whether or not anything that you can get through any particular screen of any kind is worth watching. We waste our time, our energy, and our brain power so that you don't have to. You're welcome. Lessons from the Screen is brought to you by PackSync through the Freedom Train Network. You can find us on www.freedomtrainradio.com or on iTunes, Google Play Music, a Stitcher, or anywhere else that you get your podcast. Be sure to head to one of those places and make sure that one of those places is the website, www.freedomtrainradio.com, to leave us a review. And be sure to head to www.pactsinc.org, that's packsync.org, to show some love and support for our sponsors. PackSync is a black activist and advocacy organization focused on developing the black community through a shift in culture, education, and economics. And as always, Lessons from the Screen is a show given to you from the black perspective. And with that being said, we're going to talk about race, and we're going to talk about racism in every show. And we'll also be looking at some lessons that can be used to improve the community should you choose to do so. During this episode of Lessons from the Screen, we will be taking a look at some of the human rights violations with a special emphasis on immigration. As black people, we should always pay extra close attention to how others are being treated, because we know that what they will do to another group of people, they will do to us. And in this case, they've done it before. In this episode of Lessons from the Screen, we will be paying attention to how immigration looks familiar. 2 years into the Trump administration, and we are seeing everything that we thought we would see, but hoped that we wouldn't. The erasure of Obama-era policies was to be expected, especially considering the relationship between the two men, not just as individuals, but as representatives of two cultures that have historically not gotten along. Although, ironically, interesting, amusingly, however you choose to phrase it, it is interesting that the legacy of Michelle Obama oddly lives on and occasionally makes a guest appearance in the mouth of Melania, the current First Lady. The embracing of white supremacists, and their alt-right conspiracies was again expected, especially given Trump's track record for racism and living in controversy. But other things that we are seeing, while we did expect them, we really hoped they would not come to pass, or we at least hoped that some of the other elected officials would be adults and get in the way of them. The disruption of global politics to the level of making friends of enemies and enemies of friends is something that we expected, but really hoped wouldn't happen, and prayed that Congress would intervene if it looked like things were going in that direction. I mean, me and my friends are still trying to figure out, how in the hell do you manage to piss off Canada? How is that even possible? We went from having strong alliances with our neighbors to the north and the south and being relatively safe on our continent to having a very troubled relationship with both of our neighbors to the north and the south, and being best friends with some of the most brutal regimes on the planet. I shouldn't say best friends just yet. There are burgeoning bromances. I'll say that. Changing military standards was something we expected, but hoped wouldn't happen, and has with the introduction of the ban on transgenders. And racism, something we all knew all too well was going to be present, but that we hoped would be kept to its usual undercover, hidden from plain sight form. And it's just reared its head loud and proud above the surface like a cancerous lump protruding even further from the skin of American society. As the moral lies that have been laid over the American foundation of cruelty have been pulled back one layer at a time, we get to the truth of what it means to be an American, a truth that has not changed since the founding of this nation. To be an American is to be white, first and foremost, and with the utmost importance. As comments about shithole countries filled with brown and black people fly out of the White House, immigration policy changes have begun to take effect. We spoke in a previous episode about immigration changes targeted at preventing immigration from African countries. Now the Trump administration has begun a mandatory policy of separating children from parents at the border as a deterrent to keep people from trying to cross, and to make matters worse, they are losing chunks of the kids in the process. In addition to that, they have immigration agents stationed ahead of checkpoints, preventing people from reaching U.S. soil and claiming asylum. Of course, these are almost always brown or black people. Immigration has become a real-world issue in these modern times of supposed openness and world-shrinking technology. And the most dangerous aspect of these talks about immigration are the seemingly endless levels of apathy that Americans can generate towards what is happening under the guise of protecting borders and extreme nationalistic ideology. And the idea prevails that white American ancestors migrated here legally, learned the language, and overcame the barriers in order to build the life enjoyed by their descendants, regardless of how the context and complexities of the current situation make that an unbalanced and unfair comparison. For starters, look, many of those Central and South American people that white people would love to keep out of America are the descendants of those same brown people that white people killed when they came and took the land for themselves without following the proper Native American protocols for establishing a relationship or following established customs and courtesies. And while some may say it's stupid to go back that far, I say it's relevant because America was built on a series of foundational sins, and immigration continues to build layer upon layer on one of them. But of course, the argument could still be made that the natives didn't have an immigration system, or even they weren't even a recognized nation. And while we could debate both of those points, and believe you me, I could, that would be getting into a bit of minutia, not to say that it's not important, just to say that it's a discussion that we can save for another day. Although I will say that people should research the Mexican-American War and just check it out to see how white Americans have routinely taken land that they wanted without regard for others, even after the founding of America. You see, prior to 1882, there was no federal immigration law. Depending on where someone landed, they could get off the boat, get a job, find shelter, and start a life without anyone caring that they didn't know the language, and it was perfectly normal to not have any sort of identification papers. In 1882, they created the first federal immigration law, but it was largely to restrict Chinese immigrants who white people felt were a threat to them in terms of labor and health. In 1924, quotas were implemented with all Asian nations, with the exception of Japan and the Philippines, being barred from entry. The Philippines was a U.S. colony, and thus Filipinos were considered United States citizens. And Japan had agreed to limit immigration on their end in what was the Gentleman Agreement. There were also no quotas of any kind for people coming from the Western Hemisphere. These quotas were in relation to the number of foreign-born people presently in the country, and with a large portion of immigrants being from Britain and other Western European countries and Northern European countries, the quota for immigrants from these countries was much higher than it was for people from other countries with less people currently in the United States. It also allowed for the exclusion of entry to any alien who was by race or nationality ineligible for citizenship, meaning that even though Japan was not on the Asian barred zone, was not a part of that group that was barred, the Asians that were barred from entering the country, they were, by virtue of still being Asians, still not allowed into the country, and this was a violation of the previously mentioned Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. So in 1882, our first federal immigration policy comes, which is solely to stop Chinese. And then in 1924, quotas were implemented and all Asian nations were barred from entry into the United States, with the exception of the Philippines, which was still